The Laowa 11mm f4.5 C Dreamer lens is a full frame camera lens, but what makes it really unique is the fact that it is rectilinear. Traditionally with wide angle lenses of this caliber, you're going to risk getting some fisheye distortion. So if you think of a GoPro, the edges are crazily warped. And if you want to fix that, you're going to have to do it in post and editing, and that takes time and computer hardware to do so. This lens fixes it inside the lens itself. So your footage is automatically going to look pretty natural. It is definitely going to feel wide angle, and it's crazy how wide angle this lens actually is. But when you compose it just right, it actually doesn't feel too out of place. So you could very easily match this with other cameras and other focal lengths. So I think that's one benefit of going with a full frame rectilinear lens. This lens comes in a variety of different mounts. I have the E mount right here, but also comes in L mount and Nikon Z mount. So if you have any of those cameras, you are good to go. I've yet to know if Laowa plans on making Canon RF lenses, but if they do, I will make sure to update you in the description. When you pick up this lens for the first time, you're going to immediately notice two things. First, how small and tiny this little lens is. And secondly, its build quality. It is very well built. It reminds me of a vintage lens of how well it's built. Very good focus throw. It's not too long, but it's very dampened and you can easily get precise focusing. At 11mm and at a 4.5, you're not going to really have much struggle focusing on this lens. You just roughly get it in place, put it at infinity, stop down, and basically everything is in focus. This video is currently being shot on a 24mm on my Sony a7S, so just for fun, let's swap it out for 11mm and just to see how drastically different it is. And bam, so without moving the camera at all, here is the difference. This is what 11mm looks like. Came and reached the frames, and it's pretty crazy how wide angle this actually is. So let's bring in the camera a little closer and get more of a better framing. So here I am holding the camera at arm's length away. You can already see how much field of view you're getting and how much you can let the background in, which is really cool. A couple things to note is if you are hand holding and you're filming yourself, is you want to watch where you're doing when you get to the edges, because you begin to get a little blurry, a little distorted, because it's trying to correct for that distortion. So stay in the middle and you begin to look a little bit more natural, more realistic. The other thing is you want to make sure you point the lens towards your chin. That way you got a perfect amount of headroom. I see a lot of vloggers have way too much headroom up here because they're looking right at the lens. So just tilt it down and you are in good shape. This is the minimum focus distance, and you can still see pretty much my full forehead. And I'm literally that far away from the camera. So it's pretty wild what you can do with this little lens. And now we're back. So definitely crazy amount of field of view. I think 24mm is pretty wide. This just sets it in a whole nother league. Another great use for such a wide angle lens is if you are doing car shows. This is wide enough that you can get both your presenter and your interviewee in the same shot. And you're not getting too crazy distortion. You see just a little bit of my car seat, but really in such tight quarters, you really do need something extremely wide. So now I just tilted the camera a little bit more towards me so you just get like a single person show or whatnot, do a podcast or whatever the case may be, and it's definitely crazy wide. So I would have to say, if you plan on doing any sort of content like this, car type of videos, this 11mm lens will probably be just right for you. There's a couple little things I was very surprised about this lens. The first being is the fact that it has a filter thread, so you can actually put on your ND filters or CPL filters. Granted, it's only 62mm, and I don't have any to test, unfortunately. However, you do want to make sure they're pretty thin filters as well. So I imagine getting something from like FEILD with these ND filters that I have. These are pretty thin in themselves, so you're probably good going for something like that in the 62mm size. So yeah, that's very surprising. The other thing is the fact that it can focus very closely, which is very surprising. So if you focus on something close enough, you can get some sort of background blur. Probably not the reason why you're strictly picking up this lens, but hey, you can definitely do that. And I much prefer having lenses that can focus closely, because there's nothing more frustrating when you're trying to set up a shot and then you have to step back in order just to achieve focus. The last characteristic of this lens is the aperture blades themselves. So in this tree b-roll, as I'm moving the camera, the sun begins to peek through the leaves and it creates this 10-point bladed sun star effect. It's definitely a unique characteristic of this lens and one of the reasons I do like it. So let's touch on the cons of this lens. Obviously, the major negative you probably have guessed is the fact that it can only open up to an f4.5, so it doesn't let in a ton of light. However, if you are using a full frame sensor, chances are you can probably raise up your ISO before your image falls apart, so it may not be such a bad thing after all. And you're definitely not trying to use this lens to create a shallow depth of field, so really a fast aperture may not be as crucial as you first might imagine. So in my test of using this 11mm lens, I found that composing and framing became really tricky, and in fact a different experience than using just a normal lens. For instance, you have to be really critical of how you place the camera in relation to your scenario, because it just lets everything in. And usually when you are composing, you're trying to eliminate the things you don't want and include the things you do want and arrange them in such a way. With an 11mm, everything is in frame, so how do you exclude things? And that's where the trick comes in. And I found you really want to be careful of your camera's height and the tilt, especially the tilt. If you tilt your camera a little bit, everything looks dramatically different. 11mm really exaggerates movement, so during these tree shots, I am just barely moving the camera, and I slowed it down even further, but you just see that everything really passes by nice and smoothly. And that is because I was so close to the tree itself. If I was further away, even a foot away, I would not have gotten the same kind of immersive feel. So if you're finding that your results are a little bit flat, a little lackluster, getting closer to your subject, find angles and ways you can actually emphasize the space, create depth, and then that will help with a wide angle. Now, why would you want an 11mm? Well, there's a couple of reasons why. If you want a really immersive look and feel to your whole footage, this definitely can come into play. If you want to capture everything, let's say maybe you're filming a wedding ceremony and you just want to show off a cathedral if you're lucky enough, this is definitely the lens to do so. I find a lot of times when I'm just composing with a normal lens like a 50 or a 35, sometimes there are shots where I want to capture everything and I have to back up really far, and then I have to get back and find a way I can compose it nicely. With 11mm, it's very different. You see everything. You're trying to get much closer. You're trying to find different foreground elements to create more of a contrast, basically. So yes, 11mm is definitely a tricky lens to use, but you can definitely use some of its quirks and some of its characteristics to enhance your filmmaking or your storytelling by using the creative flaws to your advantage. So all of this to say, I think 11mm is actually a useful tool. Again, may not be used for everything, but it definitely has its place and its uses. And I am sad that I'm going to have to return this back to Laowa, but I definitely can see maybe utilizing more ultra wide angle lenses in my future projects. So that's it for this video. Hopefully this video's been entertaining, and yeah, catch you around.
Sometimes I even frighten myself.